Okay, so as the fears about the coronavirus continue to sweep through both the country and the world, the Trump administration is actually paying attention now. Not saying they're doing anything so good, as we talked about in the hour before this, right here on our Twitch channel, act.tv. Anyway, the oil and gas industry are getting a lot of attention from the Trump administration. Producers of crude oil have vowed to continue oversupplying the market, even as the panic over the coronavirus pandemic grounded planes, shuttered factories, and significantly reduced the demand for crude. As of, of course, the free market Republicans who are insisting on not interfering in the energy industry to subsidize wind and solar, right? They want to bail out these industries immediately. Here to talk about all this hypocrisy, Alexander Kaufman. Alexander is a reporter at the HuffPost. He writes about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Can you talk about, so let's see, Wednesday, there was a hearing on Capitol Hill. What happened there with Secretary Mnuchin?
Well, at that hearing, Secretary Mnuchin was teasing out the idea of offering low-interest government loans to some industries that have been affected by the coronavirus-fueled downturn. So he was actually specifically calling out industries like the airline industry, cruise lines, hotels and different parts of the travel industry. And this is something that he noted that the federal government did in the weeks after 9/11, when there was excuse the verbiage, but a nosedive in air travel, and the airline companies were really struggling and were starting to lay off employees. And so he's talking about doing this. What was reported on Tuesday by the Washington Post, the very great reporter Jeff Stein over there, had some officials from the White House saying that they are also considering offering a similar program to shale frackers, so these companies that do fracking and primarily for oil, but these companies are extremely vulnerable to a dip in the price of oil, which fell pretty precipitously on Sunday.
Can you explain slightly why, if we're making our own fracked gas, and I've been anti-fracking this entire time, so if we're making our own fracked gas and products, why are we so dependent on outside nations?
Well, so what's important to understand is that this isn't that the falling price of oil is not a response to the coronavirus alone. There was a meeting last weekend of OPEC and Russia, which is not a member of OPEC, but does meet with the group that's called OPEC Plus, and they were trying to work out a deal to agree to cut production. For years now, the price of oil has been quite low, has been hovering around the $50 range. And part of that is because over the past 10 years, the fracking boom has happened in the United States and has made the United States a top producer and exporter of oil and gas. And so that has flooded the market, and that has made the US a very big player alongside Russia and Saudi Arabia and some of these other big petrostates. And so what had been hoped for is that the Saudis and the Russians would agree to a deal whereby they would cut production and the price of oil could go up. And in that environment, a lot of these fracking companies in the US would be able to make a little bit more money. That deal did not happen. And the Russians were actually quite explicit about their desire to, really rein in this US shale industry that has gobbled up a significant amount of market share. This is also happening at the same time when the US is opposing a gas pipeline that the Russians want to build into Europe to supply customers in Europe. And in place of it, the United States is saying, hey, Europe, we'll sell you our gas, so you don't have to buy from the Russians in the first place. So there's a lot of geopolitical jockeying here that comes aside from the financial and economic crisis that is stemming from from the coronavirus. But oil, like any commodity, is priced on a global market, and the sale of it, even if it is being produced here, is affected by trade all over the world.
So talk about this bailout program that the federal government is considering. Why in this moment is the federal government more concerned about business than they are about human beings?
Well, I'll leave your viewers to reach a conclusion about that. And I don't I would expect that if they're watching this show, they've been given more than enough information and tools to glean why that may be the case. But
Thank
but
you.
but I what's happened. So first, to be clear, there is no established program and there's no clear proposal yet. This is something that has been floated and discussed, and it has not necessarily happened yet. It is worth noting that there's a chance it won't happen at all. As I wrote in a story that published this morning, the political appetite for this is going to be quite low, and I'll explain why. The fracking industry, to start with the obvious for what I think we know,
Yes.
is a major threat to worsening climate change. It is a major source of emissions, specifically methane emissions, that are they stay in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time than carbon dioxide, but during that shorter period of time, have a much higher warming potential than carbon dioxide. They are also very likely undercounted by the federal government. There was a study that came out of the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2018 that found that the EPA was undercounting methane emissions from the oil and gas industry by a whopping 60%. And so you have
Wow.
Right. So there are a lot of issues that, aside from issues around water contamination and the myriad other pollution problems that stem from fracking. But let's just talk about the finances. So the fracking industry has rapidly expanded across the United States over the past decade, in large part due to a lot of cheap, low interest money that they were getting from Wall Street. They have borrowed tremendously from Wall Street and have generally failed to make a profit. Now, many of them have blamed the low price of oil for that, but a lot of investors would say that they also have been extremely undisciplined with the capital that they've been given. They have spent very aggressively, and in doing so, have not even really managed to live up to the promise of jobs, which is really the real political token here that you think about. And so, there was a figure that came from the top analyst at the consultancy Wood Mackenzie, where since 2018, they haven't hiring in the industry has been completely flat, in spite of Trump's touting it as booming and having all this success under him, and getting all of its wish list in terms of deregulation. And but productivity has actually gone up 30%. So they're pumping more oil, which is making it harder for them to earn a profit. And in the meantime, they're actually not, providing any more jobs to anyone. So
I
it is
find this enraging. I mean, my
why it would be a
response here.
difficult sell. You can see why it would be a difficult sell, even to the most hardline climate denialist Republican. If they really believe in the market, it's a little difficult to say, "Hey, let's reward, these reckless borrowers." So you won't give 18-year-olds who go into debt to go to college a break on their debt, because you fear that you'll be penalizing the people who worked hard to pay off their college, or didn't borrow recklessly, but we're going to do that exact kind of thing for fracking companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think that these hardline Republicans actually believe in the market. I think they just do whatever's right for corporations, and they hide under "we believe in the market." But I'm not. You don't have to respond, because as a journalist, your job is just give us the facts, right? I don't want to put you on the spot for anti-corporatist opinion. So how? Uh, what should we be on the lookout for as this sort of continues? What kind of argument do you think the government would make to give this kind of bailout, underneath the guise of, say, coronavirus I'm just assuming they're going to be like, okay, well, we're going to bail out the airline industry and we're going to bail out these other industries soon. And they're just going to bail out the oil industry yet again. Do you think that's possibly on the horizon?
Uh, it's difficult to know exactly what the argument they would make is. I think it's important to note that Stephen Mnuchin, when he was meeting on Capitol Hill, uh, refused to call it a bailout. 4 times, in fact, according to the Washington Post, he said, this is not a bailout. This is something different. Now, there was.
We don't have a different word for it, but I'll come up with something with McKinsey, as what's being said in my
right
in the chat here.
It's a real war is peace kind of thing. But this is. You can imagine that the Trump administration is going to say, oh, this is important to avoid layoffs in some of these critically important swing states. The fracking industry in Pennsylvania is something he has embraced as a means of strengthening his position in that swing state. And so it's not hard to imagine that they may pitch this as a short and temporary and shrewd lifeline to provide to an important engine of economic growth in this country.
Why can they be relied on to always do the wrong thing? I mean, I'd be thrilled if they're like, you know what, instead of the fracking, we're going to put a lot of money into solar right now so that we can, give everyone access to energy, even if the energy people can't get to work and, your lights are going to turn off. Like, we're in the middle of a civil, crisis here. And they're still concerned about destroying the environment and the market. This is just, at what point is their insanity going to become very obvious? I think, your story points out the insanity, behind this. Oh, when are people going to figure this out, Alex?
I think it's important to note that we live in a time where there is a deeply fragmented media ecosystem, and that this is not the story that avid Fox News listeners, or quite frankly, and probably more importantly, avid listeners of drive time talk radio, conservative talk radio.
That's all there is. There is no other drive time talk radio
right.
on the major networks.
So that's a completely different worldview and one that can be comfortably detached from reality. I will say this, because this is something I've been dwelling on. My grandmother died last week, and we buried her.
Oh, I'm sorry.
She lived a good life, but
still,
she a spouse of a relative who was there started talking to me, and at first wanted to, her husband was saying, oh, she's a big Trump supporter, and I was like, okay, I can talk to. She's a suburban Trump supporter from Long Island, and I can predict the arguments that this is going to be somebody who cares about the stock market, cares about
taxes.
Taxes. Those are not things that I necessarily always agree with, but those are things that I can speak to, and that is not even remotely where she was coming from. This is somebody who, despite being a very comfortable upper middle class person, had been radicalized by online conspiracy theories and was there yelping about chemtrails, about fluoride in the water controlling our minds, and about how in 3 years' time Trump was going to supplant all existing media and religion, with something far superior. And I'll be honest with you, I was very at peace with my grandmother's passing, and I was depressed for the rest of the day after that, because it was a good reminder that there are people, and not desperate people, regular people who are in comfortable positions in life, who are just consuming absolute nonsense and things that are just completely detached from reality, and are living their lives as if this is a factual measure of the world in which they are living. So that is an extreme example, but I think it's a useful example to remember that There are a lot of people who are simply just living in a completely different reality that where they don't have to even contend with the fact that a bailout like this may happen, much less, whether or not it's fair, whether or not it's,
Wow.
the environmentally or economically sound thing to do.
I don't even have a response to that. I mean,
I have a
I know
question
what you
about
mean.
that.
It's, yeah, go ahead, Alex.
I have a question, Alex. In terms of tracking how people are getting radicalized, because of all this micro targeting that is happening, I worry that someone like me who is following certain news outlets and things like that, I'm not seeing a lot of that, obviously. But
Yeah.
even if I go into those groups, I might not be making the cut for some of these micro targeting that is happening, that is resulting in all of these radicalization. And so then when you have an encounter like the one you just had, you think that you have a vague idea of where they're going to come from, and they're not at all there. Um, are there any good mechanisms for knowing sort of what is happening in some of these other bubbles,
Yeah.
media bubbles?
I don't have the names off the top of my head, but if you search around, there's been a lot of really great coverage on getting outside your bubble. BuzzFeed has done a lot of good stuff on this, and there are a lot of
I
really
like my bubble.
well, there are a lot of really, but more specifically to what I think you're asking about, Alex. There are some really great reporters, like at NBCnews.com, here at HuffPost, and elsewhere, who have been doing really thoughtful and rigorous reporting on online conspiracy theories and on the propagators of them, and ultimately on the beneficiaries of them, because it's notable that when you have a bunch of people with a mad look in their eyes yelling about how there are a bunch of lizard people, pedophiles running the government, and
Right.
keeping child sex slaves in a in a pizzeria in the middle of DC, that there are in
Where
fact
else would you keep them?
political movements that benefit from those things, even if it isn't obvious on the face of it. And so,
Alex, that's great. We're going to try to reach out to some of your colleagues. So we will drop your name saying that you mentioned them in one of our interviews. Actually, that would make a great segment. So hopefully I'll reach out to you after this about that. Because you also do the your work on the politics of life on a warming planet, and we are all sort of almost completely preoccupied with coronavirus. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to offer the audience in terms of the intersection between global climate change and this current pandemic?
well, I wish that people were as eager to act quickly and radically as they are about this with climate change. But I think that the main takeaway here, and to quote a line that I saw in a piece that ran in the Atlantic this week. Just as there are no atheists in foxholes, there are no libertarians in a crisis. And what I think
Well said.
what I think this pandemic makes clear is that this system of shrinking government, and of putting things in the hands of the private sector, and of disabling our ability to act collectively to a problem that requires collective large-scale action, is criminal, and is completely hampering our ability to do anything. And quite frankly, the fact that things like the Green New Deal, or things like different types of proposals that would make a meaningful impact on climate change, the fact that that has been depicted as somehow radical, and what we are doing instead is not, or that is somehow ideological, and what we are doing is not, is a complete misunderstanding of the situation, and quite frankly is a complete indoctrination from Cold War era beliefs. You know, in the same way that certainly
Boomers.
same way that I grew up as an end of history kid. You know, I was in New York public schools in the 90s and learning about Fukuyama and learning about how, you know, these silly brainwashed commies, you know, really believed that their system was effective and that, you know, if only they were able to see the light, you know, maybe they could have avoided their own collapse. And it's hard not to think back on that pretty frequently these days and see a very similar situation where it's a complete ignorance of the fact that the United States, like most countries, is a mixed economy. And right now, the balance between, you know, laissez-faire capitalism and you know, a big government, Marxist or whatever approach is completely off. And it makes us woefully ill-equipped to respond to a crisis like COVID-19 or like climate change. And so my hope is that, you know, an outbreak like this will be brief and will be a useful reminder that, you know, in fact, the invisible hand is not, you know, infinitely wise about all things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. And I look forward to having you back here in 2 weeks. If we're all still here, who knows? You should follow Alex on Twitter at Alex C. Kaufman, Kaufman. I believe we discussed this when we were on WBI, that there's an Alex Kaufman without the C, and that's a different guy. So
he's a Republican state lawmaker in Georgia, and I'm sure he hates me.
Well, we love you and we appreciate all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being on our program, and good luck to you in the world. Just like I wish. And I'm sorry about your grandmother. Even though she lived a good life, it always still.
Thank you. She was a wonderful woman, Barbara Kaufman. Anyway, thank you. Good to see you. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.